Good afternoon, everybody. So what I wanted to talk about today was actually how to scale and productionalize your data science process and really, start to take it from almost a handcrafted, lovingly handcrafted beverage to an assembly line. And be able to move models through a pipeline at scale. Sometimes, depending on your application, you need to have hundreds or thousands of models in order to achieve your business results. And so really what I wanted to talk about was the 6 steps that we take at Gap as part of our kind of analytics and model productionalization process. And I like to think about these 6: intake, exploring the data. So now we're starting to get into the actual building of the models, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here because I think this is where we really spend a lot of our time talking about it as data scientists. Building the models, iterating and refining our models, deploying it, and then of course, how do we support it? And it's these things around the edges that we don't really talk about a whole lot. There's a lot of variation in between companies on exactly how we do this. So I wanted to talk about some of the things that I've learned along my journey at Gap and some of the companies I've worked at previous to that. So first of all, let's talk about intake. One of them is establishing really strong relationships with your business partners. So how many people in here are actual practitioners of data science, actual fingers on the keyboard data scientists? How many of you wish you had more context, more contact with your business partners around what's going on, connected with their goals and their outcomes? And that's why I think it's really strong, really important to establish these relationships with your business partners so you can help get the context, get the business priorities to help make your models better. We use analytical consultants, really these people that sit kind of in between data science and business and are able to, kind of translate, help put things in context and help create strategies around how we're going to use data science. It's also really helpful to leverage or to use tracking and workflow tools. Take your projects, it's not only just a to-do list, but how can you assign certain aspects of the project to people? And then, of course, the big one for us is using product reviews to make sure that teams are heading in the right direction, that they're getting the right input from the executive teams, from the business teams, to keep all of the projects going in the right direction and avoiding surprises all the way at the end. Next up is, as you're exploring the data, we like to standardize our EDA. And that's not to say, do the same things every time, but think about the approach every time. Definitely ensure and mechanize your upstream data quality. How much time do we spend chasing down problems in our data where if we had better data quality upstream, we could definitely spend more time on the more important components of building data science and models. Also building analytics-ready data structures. This is something that we've spent quite a bit of time on. So instead of going out to the databases, running the same queries with the same joins every time, we've automated a lot of that process for our teams so that they can just start to go in and hit data marts that are ready for analytics. And those are going to be, solve 80% of our problems. And then we leave our data scientists to solve that remaining 20%. And then finally here, building systems and tools to help mechanize that routine work. We like to leave our most expensive resources, our data scientists, to do the creative and nuanced work that they do so well and let the computers do the heavy lifting. Next up is building the models. So using standard processes and cookbooks, depending on the type of problem we're solving, so that we understand what types of inputs are we likely to need, what type of work's going to be in the middle, and then how are we going to get that all the way down to whatever consuming system or process or analytic is there. My team spends a lot of time building helper functions to help automate routine and repetitive work. These are things like loading scores up into a data warehouse, a lot around EDA and other types of helper functions. Obviously, provide version control and backup tools. This is really important as you're kind of thinking about through these mechanized production processes that you can always roll back if there's a problem. And then finally on this build section, providing really good reference materials. so that you have a library of materials available to your teams so that they don't have to go out and spend a whole lot of time searching for things, sometimes finding things that are not vetted, that are not necessarily the right solutions, but making sure that we've got a good set of reference materials, academic research, industry journals, and things like that. You know, always a big part of the scientific process is building on what people have done before you, and this has been a really helpful way for us to approach that problem. So next up, iterate and refine. You know, as we move through our model productionalization process, we're often iterating on sometimes previous models, sometimes new models. We like to A/B test our models, specifically in our personalization components. So if we're building a new model that's going to go out on our e-commerce site, we'll A/B test it against the old model. Again, automating routine work, hyperparameter tuning and things like that, so that our data scientists don't have to spend all the time iterating through it. We provide mechanized tools to enable them to do that. And then also making it easy to iterate and try multiple solutions. If you don't have to go in and create a whole lot of code to try a bunch of different model types, then you can actually try a bunch of different model types in a whole lot faster fashion. You know, it sounds pretty obvious, but it actually really helps. And then, of course, you know, think continuous improvement and release cycles. It's not always important to put everything into that first version of the model. Sometimes you want to create a roadmap for a particular model and say, we're going to get this first part out now, we're going to test it and see how it does. And then we're going to bring in some additional components 6 months down the road, and then keep moving through the cycle with that particular model. Next up is deploy. So again, using standard processes and cookbooks. We like to use checklists to ensure there's no missteps. You know, it's the same thing that an airline pilot does before they take off. They run through a bunch of checklists to make sure that they've caught everything. We like to do that in our data operations team as well, to make sure that we've thought of all of the different components as we're rolling out these models and pushing them either to APIs or pushing batch scoring code into our systems that are going to run it. It's also really important here to have a really strong partnership with your IT, your DevOps, and your engineering teams, depending on how your organization is laid out, especially if there's going to be downstream systems that are consuming your scores. So in our case, our e-commerce platform, we've got a really strong partnership with the little part of IT that runs our e-commerce platform to make sure we've got a smooth pipeline once a model is ready for productionalization, that we can move it downstream and make it available to our e-commerce platform. And this is one of the next one, own as much infrastructure as you can. This is something that I've really focused on over the last 3 years, where we're moving more towards, you know, a DevOps data ops model, where we've got our teams that are focused on owning that end to end and reducing the number of times we have to hand off particular models. Every time you hand it off, you lose a little bit of information in the process. It's like when you used to have the cassette tapes for music, and you'd make a copy for your friend, and they would make a copy, and they would make a copy. By the time you got 3 copies or 5 copies down, you could barely understand what the music was. It's kind of the same thing when you're handing off projects from team to team to team. You lose a little bit of information each time. So we like to own as much of the infrastructure as we can, and then sometimes just let that last mile belong to another team. And then, of course, the last one here on the deploy is test. Just make sure you're testing at every step of the way, writing unit tests into your code, making sure that you're validating the assumptions in your model, making sure that the predictions look accurate. I've got, in a previous role, I had an engineer who worked on my team who thought as long as his code executed and he didn't get any errors, the results were going to be right. And of course, we all know that that's not reality. So really think about how you're going to test throughout the entire process so that you get accurate results and there's no surprises at the end. And then last up, how do you support these various analytical products that you're responsible for? Be prepared. Things will happen. So it's always important to be prepared. I like to have an established and documented support path so that if something happens, again, I'll use our e-commerce site for instance. Our support teams know where to come. Our executive teams, we've got, my favorite one, and this happens probably once a week, we've got a model that will assign a division preference for. We'll reorder the tabs across the top of the site. And we've got one executive who's in charge of one of the brands where every time he sees that the tabs have been reordered for him that doesn't make sense to him, he reaches out and he wants to know exactly why. So now we've got an established and documented support process that he can go through if he wants to understand why the predictions are coming out the way that they are, instead of him sending an email and it turning into a fire drill every Monday morning, which has happened more than once. The other thing is standardize those documentation requirements. It's not just good enough to come up with a model and just let it sit there, but you actually have to document it out so that other people can know what your model, what your process is doing. As part of that, I like to strive for simplicity. I do like to get my teams to go back and refactor. How little code can you use? How efficient can you make your processes? And the more simple you create, or the more simple of a process you create, the easier it is to support in the long run, especially, let's say, someone leaves company. Data science talent is very much in motion all the time. So people come in, people come out, and we want to make sure that these models can be supported long down the road. Automated alerting for anomalies. We've got code that runs tests against data sets, against model predictions, and then it'll write it to a Slack channel if there's a particular problem. In certain cases, we'll have it automatically open a ServiceNow ticket if we're seeing a data quality problem that needs to be escalated upstream. And these are all the things that you can have that you can do that helps operate at scale. And then finally here is be sure to carve out time for your break fix and your technical debt. It's one of the things that we all accumulate, and it's one of the things that we all forget to go back and fix. I like to say 10 to 20% of every release cycle, especially for our bigger products, are dedicated to break fix and technical debt. That way it doesn't accumulate too much. So if you take all of these things into account as you're designing your productionalization process, how you're going to scale your teams, how you're going to go from 3 data scientists to 100 data scientists, and how you're going to go from 10 models to 10,000 models. These are some of the things that I've found throughout my career that I find really helpful. And that is putting it together. All right.
Hi, thanks for that great talk. So in the exploratory phase, I struggle with this tension between iterating quickly and trying out a lot of stuff and developing robust code. So how do you, what's your advice for people in that phase of this? It seems like you've got this whole process pretty well scoped out. So how do I strike that balance?
That's actually one of the trickiest parts. It is very tricky. I think all of us as data scientists are very creative and curious people, and we want to try a lot of different things. And it's about finding the right balance. And it's different for every project. It's different for every team. But the way I like to think about it is, again, back to that 80-20 rule. Is spending an additional 2 weeks of effort, how much lift is that going to give you? Are we talking about, a 5% in predictive quality? Or are we talking about a 0.05% in predictive quality? And those are the types of things that help me figure out whether it's time to call it a day and move on, put it in the tech debt in a future cycle, or to continue exploring that data.
Thanks.
I'm wondering a bit about, as you have different teams at different points in their life cycles, how you need to flex the amount of control that you put in place, and just how the process varies for a new product versus a very, very stable product.
Yeah, so I would say, kind of on the new product side, it's definitely a lot more flexible. You have to allow for a lot more variability in the process, especially if it's an entirely new function that you haven't worked with. Definitely, as you're iterating on the same model, hopefully you've built a lot of automation kind of into that process already. Sometimes it comes down to the talent you're using. Focusing, and this is something that I've done before, where kind of the newer projects that we haven't really done before. So if we're veering into a new area of personalization, like one of the things that we're doing now is promo effectiveness, making sure that we're spending our discount dollars properly. And it's not part of an established team. So we've got a group of data scientists in my org that focus on those types of problems, brand new, that aren't established. And they've got a big they've got a lot of leeway in how they go about solving the problems, and it's much less of a mechanized process versus something, let's say, a lifetime value model, which is, it's been in place for 3 or 4 years, and we're constantly iterating and getting better predictions, but it's a little bit more established. And those are probably we tend to assign those to the more junior members of the team so that they can get established with the methodology of the technology stack and the process before they're kind of left out on their own.
So it seems like a lot of the recommendations here are around standardization of process and mechanization and automation and checklists, and these are all good ideas. I've tried to implement some of them in our group, and when I've done that in the past, I've gotten a lot of pushback from folks in our group about they feel like they're being put in a straitjacket. How can they do their job with this level of control, et cetera, et cetera. So I was wondering if that was something that you experienced as well, and if so, how have you dealt with that?
It definitely is. It's definitely, as a data scientist myself, I completely understand that. You don't want to put constraints on the creative process. And a lot of the work that we do is very creative. There's as much art in modeling as there is science. And so, again, it's finding the right balance. It's looking for the right use cases for this type of process and not putting everything down the same pipes. So for instance, I was mentioning that promo effectiveness, like that work doesn't apply to this model because it's not intended to be mechanized. But things like personalization models are a little bit easier to put down that path. So sometimes it's about having multiple paths to go down and not everything following the same process.
Question here. First of all, I want to point out for folks who can't see your amazing tattoo of the beta hat normal equation on your arm. I think that's phenomenal.
I got this to cheat during grad school.
That's amazing. Yeah. So you mentioned test. I think it's awesome. What specifically are you most focused on testing? Because you could test input data for quality. You could test your helper functions, and in your model building process, you could test the output of your models in deployment. What's most important? And
all of the above, but really testing the input data. I think that's really important, especially we're in a multi-brand environment, and sometimes we get data of differing qualities from different brands. They all have their own processes. Let's say in the store, our e-commerce platform's a little bit more unified, but in store there could be things that are going on. So it's about checking the assumptions of the data. How do we resolve all the customer identities? One of the things that I always get my teams to test is, if we have clusters of customers and under a single master ID that are just too large for reality. Like if we've collapsed 10,000 customers into a single ID, there's probably a problem with that. So checking those types of things. But of course, then it's going back testing your previous data through your new models to see how accurate they are. Really, I like to say test everything you can, invest in it, because otherwise you're going to be paying for it down the road, chances are, whether it's in reduced prediction qualities or processes that fail because it's expecting data that's not there. You've really got to test all the way along the process.
Okay, I think one more question. Last question.
Just to follow up on that, there's a lot of talk about like fast to market, you know, get that model, get the data, turn around the decision. And yet every time I hear these people talk about what it takes to really properly deploy a model, I hear a lot of work and underappreciated work maybe. How do you deal with that tension of between this is the work it takes to properly put something into production against the expectation that you get, you have an executable, you have a model, okay, let's get it out there, let's get that running.
Yeah, so that's you know, for me it's about setting expectations up front and kind of baking it into the timeline. It's really important, you know, to have that speed to market. But I always like to ask people, I'm like, okay, do you want it fast or do you want it right? Because you can't always have both. And sometimes you throw a third variable in. Do you want it fast? Do you want it right? Or do you want it production quality? And it's really hard to optimize against all three of those. If it's a business partner, I like to put the decision back on them. I'll explain the trade-offs. We can get you a really fast model out tomorrow that's going to give you you know, slightly better than flipping a coin predictions, or you can give us a month and we can come out with a model that is probably 80 or 90% accurate. So sometimes when you explain it that way to your business partners, they start to understand. The other thing that I really like to do is educate the business partners. So tell the marketers, how does this process work? These are all of the different things in the process. Have them come sit with a data scientist for a day or even a week, or just follow the project along. And I find that that helps create a lot of empathy for what the teams are going through. I like to go back and explain the data quality problems. Again, if we're having problems with customer resolution, I'll go back to those executives and say, okay, this is why it's happening, because you forwarded an email with a link to your wife. And she clicked on it, and now we resolved your two profiles together, and all of a sudden we think that you're buying kids' clothes even though you think that you're not, because it looks like to our systems based off of the rules that we've assigned that you're the same person. So again, it's explaining those trade-offs to your business partners and sometimes letting them make the decision for you, and sometimes nudging them in the right direction.
Okay, well, let's round of applause for Matt. Thank you.